Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Forgotten Ritual.
My family and I had just moved to a remote village in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania, seeking solitude away from the noise of city life. The village, with its charming old houses and scenic surroundings, seemed perfect for a fresh start. However, as we settled in, I couldn't shake the palpable tension among the villagers, especially when the topic of an old tradition came up. The elders spoke in hushed tones about a ritual that had once been crucial to the village's safety but was now long forgotten. As we got to know the village, we pieced together fragments of the story. The ritual had been a yearly event meant to protect the village from an ancient evil that supposedly lurked in the woods. But with time, the younger generation, including myself, began to question these old beliefs. Many of us saw the ritual as an outdated superstition and chose to ignore the warnings. We were convinced that such things were relics of a bygone era, irrelevant to our modern lives. Little did we know, that decision would soon have dire consequences. On the night when the ritual was supposed to take place, an unsettling calm settled over the village. I noticed something felt off, an eerie quietness enveloped the streets, and even the usual nighttime sounds were absent. The older villagers seemed to be on edge, their faces marked by a mixture of fear and resignation. We were too engrossed in our own lives to pay much attention, dismissing their anxiety as overreaction. As we went about our evening, the weight of their unspoken fears hung in the air, but we were oblivious to the impending horror. The morning after the night we missed the ritual was met with a chilling sense of dread. 3 villagers were discovered dead under circumstances that defied explanation. The bodies were found in their homes, sprawled out in unnatural positions with expressions of sheer terror frozen on their faces. There were no visible injuries or signs of a struggle, just an eerie stillness that spoke volumes. As word of the death spread, a palpable fear gripped the village. Whispers of an ancient curse that had been long forgotten resurfaced, growing louder with each passing hour. While some insisted the deaths were due to natural causes, others, particularly those who had heard the old tales, felt a creeping unease that something far darker was at play. That night, the village seemed to plunge into an abyss of darkness. Inside our home, inexplicable disturbances began. Objects took on a life of their own. My grandmother's antique clock, which had always been reliable, chimed erratically at odd hours, while kitchen cabinet doors swung open and shut without a breeze to explain their motion. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness, and the silence was shattered by unsettling creaks and groans from seemingly nowhere. My family and I were plagued by vivid nightmarish visions that felt disturbingly real, leaving us drenched in sweat and struggling to distinguish between dream and reality. Shadows seemed to dance at the edge of our vision, shifting and moving in ways that defied logic, and whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs, seemed to come from every corner of the house, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. As days turned into nights, the phenomena only intensified. Lights flickered with an erratic intensity, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. Strange symbols, arcane and unfamiliar, began to appear around the village. They were scrawled on walls, carved into tree trunks, and etched into the dirt in patterns that sent shivers down our spines. The disappearance of more villagers became a grim reality, each one vanishing without a trace, their homes left eerily untouched. The village, once a picturesque haven, had morphed into a place of fear and confusion. The old stories about the ritual, which we had so blithely dismissed as mere superstition, now loomed large in our minds. The warnings we had ignored seemed to manifest in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, and every whisper that slipped through the cracks of our sanity. Desperate for answers, I threw myself into researching the village's history and the forgotten ritual. I started with the local library, an old building with dusty shelves that seemed to hold the weight of countless untold stories. Hours turned into days as I pored over faded records and musty books, my hands trembling with anxiety. The more I read, the more it became clear that the ritual was no mere superstition but a vital defense against a malevolent force. The ancient texts described in chilling detail how the ritual was performed to keep the entity, something dark and vengeful, at bay. Each piece of information added to a growing sense of horror. Our negligence had not just been a harmless oversight, it had opened a door to something dangerous and ancient. Reaching out to the village elders was my next step. I approached them with a mix of hope and trepidation, expecting resistance or dismissal. To my surprise, they were more forthcoming than I had anticipated. They spoke in hushed, somber tones, revealing the gravity of the situation. The elders shared fragmented memories of the ritual, describing ceremonies and offerings that were meant to appease the entity. They admitted their fears and regrets about the ritual's abandonment. With every detail they provided, it became clear that the entity's aggression had intensified with each year of neglect, its presence growing stronger and more malevolent. As the village descended further into chaos, it became evident that we had no choice but to attempt the ritual ourselves. Panic fueled our every decision as we scrambled to gather the necessary materials. The elders gave us cryptic, incomplete instructions, and I did my best to piece them together. Each item had to be sourced, from rare herbs to ceremonial artifacts, but even with everything gathered, there was no guarantee the ritual would succeed. The mounting terror and the escalating phenomena left us no choice but to act, even if we were uncertain of the outcome. Our attempts to recreate the ancient rites were fueled by desperation, driven by the hope that we could reverse the horrors we had unleashed and save the village from the darkness that had been stirred. We prepared for the ritual with a sense of urgent dread. The village, once a haven of tranquility, was now a place of fear and mistrust. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly greetings now avoided eye contact, their expressions shadowed by suspicion and panic. Following the fragmented instructions, we gathered the items needed for the ritual: ancient herbs, sacred artifacts, and ceremonial tools. Every step felt like a race against time, and the weight of the village's desperation pressed heavily on us. We worked under the cover of night, our hands trembling as we performed the ceremonies to rectify the grave mistake of forgetting the ritual. That night, we carried out the ritual at the edge of the woods, the site where the old ceremonies were believed to have been conducted. The villagers watched from a distance, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. As we chanted the ancient incantations and made the offerings, a bone-chilling wind swept through the clearing, causing the flames of our torches to flicker wildly. The darkness seemed to press in on us, and the shadows around the woods deepened, as if something unseen was watching and waiting. The ritual felt like a desperate gamble, a final fraught attempt to undo the evil we had unwittingly unleashed. For a brief moment after the ritual, it seemed as if we had achieved a tentative victory. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the strange occurrences that had plagued the village appeared to diminish. Objects stopped moving on their own, and the eerie whispers that had become a constant background noise faded into silence. We allowed ourselves a cautious sense of relief, hoping that our efforts had succeeded in calming the malevolent force. However, the relief was short-lived. A lingering unease gnawed at us, a reminder that the darkness was still very much present, and the battle to protect our village was far from over. Despite the fleeting calm we had experienced, it quickly became clear that the malevolent force was far from vanquished. Strange occurrences returned, but this time with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The village, once bustling with life, was now a place of palpable dread. It felt as if the darkness had grown stronger, feeding off our fear and desperation. The whispers in the night had become an all-encompassing roar, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights seemed to stretch and writhe with a life of their own. On the final night, it became apparent that the entity was manifesting in a way that we had never seen before. The darkness was almost tangible, pressing in on us from all sides. The shadows grew longer and more menacing, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out with malevolent intent. The whispers had become a cacophony of rage and sorrow, echoing through the empty streets and into our homes. With our backs against the wall and the village on the brink of despair, we gathered for one last, desperate attempt to confront the evil. We performed a final ritual, a synthesis of every piece of knowledge and every scrap of courage we had accumulated. The air was thick with tension as we chanted the ancient words and made the final offerings. The entity fought back with a fury that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The darkness swirled around us, a living, pulsing force of evil that sought to engulf us all. As the night wore on, the struggle reached a fever pitch. We held our ground, using every ounce of our strength and willpower to complete the ritual. When dawn finally broke, the malevolent force had been driven away, but the victory came at a steep price. The village was left scarred and battered, a shell of its former self. Many lives had been lost, and the community was forever altered by the horror we had faced. The old traditions and warnings, once dismissed as mere superstition, were now etched into our collective memory as a haunting reminder of the darkness we had barely escaped. The village would never be the same, and neither would we.
The Cursed Well.
I had just moved my family to a quaint, seemingly picturesque village in rural Pennsylvania, hoping for a fresh start away from the chaos of city life. The village, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods, had a certain charm with its old-fashioned houses and friendly faces. The air was crisp, and the scenery was almost idyllic, exactly what we needed to escape our hectic past. However, there was one part of the village that seemed to cast a shadow over its otherwise perfect facade: the old well at the edge of the village center. On our first day, while getting acquainted with our new surroundings, we asked the locals about the well. Their reactions were immediate and unsettling. They fell silent, their faces tightening with unease. "It's just a relic," they murmured, but their hushed tones and averted gazes spoke of something more sinister. They urged us not to go near it, but their cryptic warnings only made me more curious. We brushed it off as local superstition, convinced that it was merely an old wives' tale, not realizing that we were ignoring a dangerous omen. As we settled into our new home, we discovered that it lacked a reliable water source. Our options were limited, and with no immediate alternatives, we decided to use the well's water. The villagers' warnings echoed in my mind, but necessity overrode my apprehensions. We filled our water tanks, hoping that the well, despite its ominous reputation, would serve our needs. That night, as we tried to unwind in our new house, strange things began to happen. Shadows in the corners of our rooms seemed to move on their own, and my daughter's toy figures were found in odd places, far from where she had left them. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the move, or perhaps an overactive imagination, but the unease that settled over our home was unmistakable. Little did I know, these were just the beginning of the unsettling events that would soon engulf our lives. The first night after we started using the well marked the beginning of our nightmare. It began subtly, small items disappearing from the house. Keys vanished from the kitchen counter, utensils went missing from the drawers. My wife and I laughed it off, attributing it to forgetfulness or simple misplacement. But when more significant items started disappearing, like my wallet and our family photos, we could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to drift through the house. I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear soft, unintelligible murmurs. Each time I got up to investigate, the house was always eerily empty and still. My wife and I tried to rationalize these occurrences as the product of an overactive imagination, perhaps the result of stress from the move. But the whispers persisted, growing more persistent and chilling with each passing night. Things took a darker turn with our youngest daughter, Lily. She began to talk about an imaginary friend she called the voice from the well. At first, we thought it was just a phase, an innocent byproduct of adjusting to a new home. But her descriptions of this unseen presence were disturbing. She spoke of it with a familiarity that was unsettling, recounting details about the well that she couldn't possibly have known. She described it as if she had seen it with her own eyes, and her stories grew more specific and eerie each day. The mounting evidence of strange occurrences started to weigh heavily on us. The combination of disappearing objects, the persistent whispers, and Lily's unsettling conversations made it impossible to dismiss these as mere coincidences. The warnings from the villagers, once thought to be superstition, now loomed over us with a terrifying gravity. The disturbances in our home escalated to a level that was beyond unsettling. Objects continued to vanish without explanation. Items we had just seen moments before seemed to disappear into thin air. Our nights were plagued by eerie noises, creaks in the floorboards, faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. Lily's imaginary friend, once a source of innocent conversation, now seemed to cast a malevolent shadow. Her once cheerful demeanor had shifted to one of fear and distress, and she would often wake up crying from nightmares she couldn't fully explain. Driven by desperation to understand what was happening, I threw myself into researching the well. I unearthed old, faded records from the village archives and interviewed longtime residents who reluctantly shared their memories. The stories were consistently chilling, tales of people disappearing or suffering strange misfortunes after coming into contact with the well's water. It seemed that the well was not merely a relic, but a source of an ancient and dark force that preyed on those who dared to use it. My attempts to gather more information from the villagers were met with fear and silence. When I broached the subject of the well, their faces would pale, and they would quickly change the subject or retreat into their homes. Their palpable fear and reluctance to discuss the well only deepened my concern. It became clear that whatever was happening was not just a local superstition, but something far more sinister and deeply embedded in the village's history. The sense of dread grew heavier each day. The once innocuous old well had transformed into a nightmarish focal point of our fears. As I pieced together the chilling accounts of the well's dark legacy, it became apparent that my family and I were in grave danger. The well's malevolent force seemed to be targeting us specifically, and the growing darkness around us was a constant reminder of the peril we faced. Determined to find a solution, I plunged into the village's history with renewed fervor. My research led me to a grim revelation. The well was not just a relic, but a crucial part of an ancient ritual site. It had once been used for dark ceremonies, and its history was tainted with tales of people disappearing after coming into contact with its water. The more I learned, the clearer it became that the well was cursed, a conduit for a dark force that preyed on those who dared to use it. In my quest for answers, I managed to find a local historian who was willing to speak with me. He was an elderly man with a grave demeanor, and his eyes grew somber as he recounted the well's dark past. According to him, the well had been central to a community ritual meant to ward off evil spirits. After a series of tragic events that left the village in shock, the ritual ceased, and the well was abandoned. It was left to languish in darkness, a sinister relic of a bygone era. The historian suggested that our use of the well's water had awakened the malevolent force that had been lying dormant. The revelation was chilling. Desperate to protect my family, I pressed the historian for solutions. He spoke of a cleansing ritual that could potentially break the curse, but it was fraught with challenges. The ritual required specific ingredients and had to be performed at a precise time. The urgency of the situation left me no choice but to take immediate action. I had to gather the necessary items and prepare for the ritual, hoping it would be enough to dispel the dark force that had invaded our lives. As I set about organizing the ritual, the weight of our predicament settled heavily on my shoulders. Every moment felt like a race against time, as the malevolent presence continued to terrorize us. My family's safety depended on my ability to execute the ritual correctly and in time. With each passing day, the darkness seemed to grow stronger, and the pressure to find a solution became more intense. With the necessary items gathered and the ritual meticulously prepared, we approached the well on a moonless night. The village was eerily quiet, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. My heart pounded as we began the ritual, chanting ancient words I barely understood while pouring the specially prepared mixtures into the well. Lily, clutching a protective charm tightly in her small hand, stood by our side. Her fear was palpable, but her trust in us was unwavering. We had promised her safety, and we were determined to fulfill that promise. As we performed the ritual, the air grew colder and heavier. Shadows seemed to twist and writhe around the well, and the whispers from the night coalesced into a haunting cacophony of rage and sorrow. The malevolent presence we had felt before became almost tangible, pressing against us with an oppressive force. It was as if the darkness itself was fighting back, unwilling to let go of the terror it had inflicted upon us. The climax of the ritual was the most harrowing. We had to confront the well directly as we completed the final incantation. The well reacted violently. It seemed to convulse and writhe as if alive. A horrific wail erupted from within, echoing through the night and shaking the ground beneath our feet. A dark, swirling mist began to rise from the well, reaching out with tendrils that threatened to envelop us. We stood our ground, our voices raised in defiance, pouring every ounce of our strength into completing the ritual. As the last words of the incantation were spoken, the mist began to dissipate. The ground settled, and the oppressive weight that had hung over us lifted. The well, once a symbol of our deepest fears, now appeared ordinary and benign. The chilling presence that had plagued us seemed to be gone. The hauntings ceased, and the inexplicable disappearances stopped. Our home, though scarred by the ordeal, began to return to a semblance of normalcy. We knew we had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than death, and the well, which had once been a source of terror, became a stark reminder of the darkness we had faced and conquered.
The early morning visitor.
After everything that had happened, I thought a fresh start in a quiet village would be exactly what I needed. The hustle and chaos of the city had worn me down, and when I found this small, secluded village nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, it seemed like the perfect escape. The air was clean, the nights were quiet, and the people, though reserved, were friendly enough. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved at a slower, more manageable pace. The village itself was almost idyllic. The houses were old but well maintained, each one with its own little garden. The streets were lined with trees that provided a canopy of shade during the day, and at night, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But as peaceful as it seemed, there was something about this place that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The villagers were kind, but they kept to themselves, especially when the sun began to set. It was as if an unspoken rule dictated that everyone should be indoors by nightfall, and I noticed that most of them took great care to secure their homes as dusk approached. I told myself it was just the way of life in a place like this, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Still, I was determined to find peace here, so I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on settling in. The first few weeks passed without incident. I spent my days exploring the surrounding countryside, reading, and getting to know the few neighbors who were willing to engage in small talk. But then, one morning, something strange happened. I had always been diligent about locking up before bed, a habit I carried over from my time in the city. But that morning, I found the front door slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just a crack, as if someone had gently nudged it. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had been tired and hadn't shut it properly. But the same thing happened the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time, I was certain I had locked it the night before, yet each time, there it was, just slightly open. I mentioned it to one of my neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, who lived a few houses down. She gave me a strange look, a mix of concern and something else. Fear, perhaps? She didn't say much, just that I should be more careful and that I wasn't the only one experiencing such things. When I pressed her for more details, she simply shook her head and muttered something about old stories and how it was best not to dwell on them. As the days went on, I started noticing changes in the way the villagers behaved. They seemed more on edge, especially as night approached. I overheard whispers in the local market about other houses with doors found ajar in the mornings, about things going missing or being moved during the night. No one wanted to talk about it openly, but the sense of unease was palpable. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just the overactive imagination of a newcomer in a strange place. But then the footsteps started. It was late, perhaps around 2 or 3 in the morning, when I first heard them, faint, almost imperceptible, like someone trying to move quietly just outside my door. My heart raced as I lay in bed, straining to hear, but the sound was so soft that I wasn't sure if it was real or just a figment of my imagination. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there was no one there. The night was still, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. But the footsteps didn't stop. They came back the next night, and the night after that, always at the same time, always just outside my door. I started to feel like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. And whenever I brought it up to the villagers, they would just exchange worried glances and offer vague reassurances that did nothing to ease my growing fear. Eventually, I sought out the village elders, hoping they could provide some answers, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But their response was even more unsettling. They told me to keep my doors and windows locked at night and to stay inside once the sun went down. When I pressed them about the strange occurrences, they spoke of old stories, of things best left undisturbed, but they never gave me a clear answer. As I walked home that evening, the sky darkening with the approach of night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in this village was only just beginning, and that it was far from over. After weeks of sleepless nights and a growing sense of dread, I knew I couldn't go on like this. The footsteps, the whispers of something moving outside my door in the dead of night, it was all becoming too much. My once peaceful haven had turned into a prison of fear, and I was desperate for answers, for anything that could give me back some sense of control. That's when I decided to install the cameras. I spent an entire day setting them up, positioning them strategically around the house, one by the front door, another covering the backyard, and a third by the side windows. As I mounted the last camera, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Harper peering out from her window across the street. She quickly looked away when she saw me, but not before I noticed the worry etched on her face. When I mentioned my plan to the few neighbors I was close to, I was met with mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Harper, simply nodded and warned me to be careful. Others were more vocal, dismissing the idea entirely. "You're just going to make things worse," one of them muttered. "Some things are better left alone." Most of them chose to barricade themselves inside their homes, reinforcing their doors with extra locks, keeping their curtains drawn tight. They were too afraid to face whatever was out there, but I couldn't live in fear any longer. I needed to know what was happening. That first night after the cameras were installed, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. When morning finally came, I rushed to my computer to review the footage. My hands trembled as I clicked through the files, each one displaying a still image of my quiet, empty yard. But then, in the early hours of the morning, I saw it. There, in the grainy black and white footage, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move slowly, deliberately, toward my front door. It wasn't a wild, frantic movement, but something more calculated, almost methodical. The figure seemed to hover at the edge of the camera's range, as if testing the boundaries, before inching closer. I could see the vague outline of a person, but the details were obscured, hidden in the shadows. The figure stopped just short of the door, standing there for what felt like an eternity, before turning and retreating back into the night. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. A part of me had hoped, irrationally, that there would be nothing, that I had imagined everything. But seeing it there, captured on film, made it all too real. The figure knew it was being watched. I was sure of it. The way it moved, the deliberate pace, it was like it was toying with me, letting me know that it was out there, and that it could come closer if it wanted to. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to see something, anything, that would explain who or what this visitor could be. But the more I watched, the more questions I had. I felt a cold, creeping fear settle into the pit of my stomach. I was no closer to understanding what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. Later that day, I invited a few of my neighbors over to show them the footage. We gathered in my living room, the tension thick in the air as I hit play. As the figure appeared on the screen, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Harper, who was sitting closest to me. Another neighbor, a man in his 50s named Mr. Thompson, muttered something under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's just a prank," one of them insisted, though the tremor in their voice betrayed their uncertainty. "Some kids from the next town over, trying to scare us." But the others weren't so sure. "That's not a prank," Mr. Thompson said, his voice low and serious. "Who would stand there in the middle of the night, just watching? That's not normal." The room fell silent as we all stared at the screen, the figure now gone, leaving nothing but an empty yard behind. The fear in the room was palpable. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the quiet tension that had been building in the village was suddenly spilling out into the open. The whispers turned into full-blown rumors, spreading like wildfire through the village. Some people started talking about old stories again, about things that should have stayed buried. By the time my neighbors left, the village's fragile sense of safety was unraveling. What had once been a quiet, cautious unease had turned into full-blown panic. Doors that had been left slightly ajar were now triple-locked, windows were nailed shut, and the streets were deserted by nightfall. But for all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late, that whatever was out there had already found its way in. And as I prepared for another sleepless night, the question that haunted me the most was this: what would happen when the visitor decided to come closer? The nights grew longer, and with them, the tension in the village thickened like fog. Each evening, as darkness settled over the town, I found myself dreading the inevitable, the return of the visitor. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that gnawed at me anymore. It was the certainty that something sinister was closing in. The first time I noticed the symbols was on a Tuesday. I had woken up to the usual silence of the village, the kind that always felt too quiet, too heavy. As I approached my front door to fetch the morning paper, I froze. There, etched into the wood, were strange symbols, crude, jagged lines that seemed to form a twisted pattern. They weren't anything I recognized, but the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. The markings weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, each line carved with care. I reached out to trace one with my fingertip, but pulled back, as if touching it might somehow invite more trouble. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. These symbols weren't just a warning. They were a promise of something far worse. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, I heard whispers around the village. Others had found the same symbols on their doors. Mrs. Harper, whose hands shook as she spoke, mentioned the marks had appeared on her back door, the one that led to her garden. Mr. Thompson found his on the garage door, deep gouges in the wood that looked almost like they had been burned in. The fear in the village was palpable, spreading like a disease. The visitor was becoming bolder, more brazen with each passing night. And with every mark left behind, the panic in the village deepened. I could see it in the faces of my neighbors as they hurried home before dusk, in the way doors slammed shut and locks clicked into place with a sense of finality. But for all our efforts to keep the darkness out, it felt like it was already inside, festering in our minds. As for me, the fear began to take a toll. I could feel myself unraveling, piece by piece. Each night, I sat in the darkness of my living room, my eyes glued to the camera feeds, waiting for the visitor to return. And every night it did. The shadowy figure grew bolder, lingering longer by my door, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed down on me. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, a pitiful attempt at protection. I kept all the lights on, as if the glow could somehow keep the visitor at bay. But nothing stopped it. Nothing even slowed it down. The symbols weren't the worst of it. The real horror came from knowing that the visitor was growing more confident, more certain in its approach. The noises outside my door became more frequent, soft scraping sounds, like nails dragging across wood, or the faintest creak of the porch as it shifted under weight. Each noise made my heart pound harder, my breath quicken. I would clutch the knife in my hand, my knuckles white with the strain, but I never opened the door. I couldn't. One night, the visitor came closer than ever. I heard the familiar footsteps, slow and measured, stopping just outside. But this time, there was something new, a sound that sent ice through my veins. It was a low, guttural whisper, the kind that you can barely hear but feel deep inside your chest. I couldn't make out the words, if they were even words at all, but they were directed at me. I felt them in my bones, a dark, insidious murmur that promised something I couldn't understand but knew I should fear. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the local police, clutching the photos of the symbols and the footage of the shadowy figure like they were my lifeline. I explained everything, the footsteps, the noises, the markings. But the officer I spoke to, a man with tired eyes and a dismissive tone, barely glanced at the evidence before shaking his head. "It's probably just some kids messing around," he said, waving off my concerns. "You know how it is in these small towns. They get bored and start causing trouble." I wanted to scream, to shake him and make him see what was really happening. But all I could do was stand there, feeling the last shreds of my sanity slipping through my fingers. When I left the station, I knew I was on my own. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Instead, I started digging into the village's history, combing through old records and archives, desperate to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. There had to be a reason, some dark secret buried in the past that had come back to haunt us. As I pored over the dusty pages and faded photographs, a pattern began to emerge. It was subtle, almost hidden, but there, a history of disappearances, strange occurrences that had been brushed aside or forgotten. Each incident separated by decades, sometimes centuries, but all connected by a common thread, the symbols. They appeared in old reports, described in vague terms by frightened villagers, always followed by a single line that made my blood run cold. No one ever saw them again. The visitor wasn't just some prankster or troublemaker. It was something far older, something that had been waiting in the shadows for a very long time. And now, it had come for us. The discovery of those symbols on my door left me shaken, but it pushed me to dig deeper into the village's past. Late one evening, I found an old map in the village's tiny library, showing that our village was built on the remains of a settlement that vanished centuries ago. The map revealed symbols, identical to the ones carved into my door, clustered around what looked like a central structure. A barely legible note read, "To protect from the darkness in the woods." The more I read, the clearer the picture became. The former villagers had practiced dark rituals, believing in something terrible that lurked in the surrounding woods. The symbols were their last line of defense, meant to ward off whatever hunted them at night. But the rituals hadn't saved them. The entire settlement had vanished, its people gone without a trace. With this newfound knowledge, I knew I had to confront the village elders. They had lived here all their lives, and they must know more. The next morning, I visited Mr. Andrews, one of the oldest and most respected elders in the village. I shared everything I had discovered, showing him the map and the symbols. Mr. Andrews listened in silence, his face grave. When I finished, he sighed deeply. "We hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said, his voice heavy with regret. He explained that the village had a history of strange disappearances whenever the visitor became active, but no one had been able to stop it. The elders had kept the secret, hoping it would never resurface. He revealed that the visitor was connected to those ancient rituals, perhaps as a guardian or a curse. The visitor wasn't just a random trespasser, it was something ancient, reawakened by our presence. And now, it was searching for something, or someone, and wouldn't stop until it found its target. I knew with a sickening certainty that the visitor had zeroed in on me. The markings on my door, the relentless nighttime visits, and the growing audacity of the figure all pointed to one horrifying truth. It was coming for me. I could no longer hide or wait for someone else to intervene. I had to face this entity head-on. I set up all the cameras around my home, my heart racing with a mixture of dread and resolve. Armed and determined, I prepared to spend the night wide awake, waiting for whatever was to come. As the night fell, the oppressive silence of my house was interrupted only by the pounding of my heart. The visitor arrived with its usual slow, deliberate footsteps. But this time, it was different. The cameras captured more than just a shadow. It revealed a figure cloaked in dark, tattered clothing. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into the camera, as if it could see me through the lens. The sheer presence of it was enough to freeze me in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tension was unbearable. Each creak of the floorboards outside my door sounded like a death knell. I watched the monitor, the figure inching closer, its movements deliberate and unnerving. Then, in the dim light of the cameras, I saw it attempt to open the door. I fought to keep it shut, my hands trembling as I pressed against it, but the door began to creak open regardless, as if the visitor's will was overpowering mine. When the door finally gave way, the visitor stepped inside. The dim lighting revealed its face, a horrifying, twisted visage that seemed almost familiar, yet grotesquely wrong. It was as if someone from the village's dark past had been reshaped into a nightmarish form, their features distorted by rage or betrayal. I was paralyzed by terror, unable to move or scream as the figure drew closer. The final moments were a blur of fear and resignation. The visitor reached out for me, and I could only watch in despair as it closed in. I felt its cold, malevolent presence envelop me, and my own face seemed to reflect in its hollow eyes, as if it was showing me my own fate. I knew then that I was no longer in control. I was merely a spectator to my own horror. In the aftermath, I recorded a final, chilling message, my voice trembling as I spoke into the camera. I told anyone who might find this footage that the visitor had taken me, and the last thing I saw was my own reflection in its eyes. The footage was all that remained of me, a grim testament to the terror that had claimed me. As I concluded my message, I knew that the village would soon be gripped by fear again, knowing that the visitor would return, seeking its next victim.